What's up YouTube, it's your boy Lamora back with another YouTube video. Today I got a bit of a story for you. A horror story actually, which is only fitting considering I just got a copy of the newly released Little Nightmares 2. So you're going to see me basically just booting up the game the first time, playing it a bit, while I give you guys what is one of the weirdest and strangest situations I've ever been in when I run games, just in general. And as a disclaimer, I'm not going to be crapping on a player that I used to run games for, because that is both petty and unprofessional. No, this is a story about someone I almost ran a game for, but ended up not doing it because of a very upside down session 0 that we had. Anyways, I'll stop talking about it and just tell you the story. But really quick, if you end up liking the video, please leave a like and subscribe to my tiny channel. It will help it grow, and also make sure it doesn't get lost in the YouTube algorithm when I end up uploading some other videos. So this story begins about 2 years ago, I think. I had a person, a potential player, message me on Reddit asking if I could run a game for them. Just them alone. And I've run solo sessions before. I've even run small adventures with just one player, maybe 2 players before. So that's not something that I haven't done. It can be really refreshing, especially because you get a lot of room to do all of the role playing that you like and really just have the ability to explore places that you wouldn't otherwise have time to when you have a large group, because you need to be aware of everyone's playtime and make sure that you guys are, I don't want to say wasting time, but exploring something that not everyone is into. So one player sessions or really small group games are actually really fun. The only problem is I told this person that I don't think I could run a game for just one person, because that's a time slot that I could be running a game for a larger group. But they said they would pay me as though they were a full party. So I'm like, oh, book it. What are we playing? And he told me Pathfinder 1st edition. Now I, at the time, and still haven't played Pathfinder 1st edition, and I told him this. I let him know that I've played Pathfinder 2nd edition playtest, because I think the playtest was out around this time, but I haven't played 1st edition. So he said it was no problem. He'll help me learn the essentials, which would be combat and things that are relevant to that character. So I'd sit down, and this is a good tip for any DM new to any system. Combat is the most important part because it tends to be the most rulesy part of any system. Get the combat down and go read the character sheets of your players, and you'll be able to figure out what rules you do need to know. Is it a fighter? Good. You don't need to know spellcasting for now. If it is a spellcaster, learn what their spells do and learn how spells are casted, prepared, all that stuff. So anyways, we planned to do exactly that. We were going to go over the combat rules, and we were going to go over what type of character he was going to play. Now, I wasn't aware at the time all of the supplements that were released by I heard there were a lot of sources for Pathfinder 1st edition, so people were able to take a feat from here, take a feat from there, take a feat from another place, and make a really strangely optimized character to the point where it's just absurd. He actually promised me that he wouldn't be doing that. So I was like, okay, fine, let's do this thing. So anyways, time passes and we get together for our session 0. And I'm going over my usual stuff, my DM style, possible setting that we'll be playing in. He had a setting that he had in mind himself, but I told him that I don't do that. It really stunts my creativity and my ability to run a good game if I'm not able to run a game in my world. It's part of why I don't really run modules, because they usually take place in whatever the Pathfinder lore is. For D&D it would be Faerun usually, or whatever settings around. I don't do well with other people's settings. I'd rather do my own. So I told him that much, and because of that, he started asking me a bunch of questions about what the world is like, what the NPCs are like, and he had this idea of playing this character that would be just a traveling adventurer, and he'd have a female companion. And I was like, okay, that's cool. He was saying that he'd like her to be a paladin, and I was like, yeah, this no problem. So we're talking a little more, and he decided to bring up the topic again and try to stress that it's really important that I'm able to describe certain things. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, what type of things are really important for me to be able to describe? And he wanted me to describe something, and then he'd give me, I guess, pointers. So obviously I saw this as a bit of a challenge. I'm perfectly comfortable with describing things without writing them because that is what I do, and I can do so in great detail if I need to. So he asked me to describe what it would be like for him meeting this NPC character that he had in mind for the first time. We thought that they might meet at a tavern because, I mean, where else do you meet in adventures except for a tavern? And so I pull out all the stops and I describe the interior. I touch on all the senses. I make sure to describe all the odors and the aromas that might come from the perfumes and the alcohol or the ale, whatever everyone else is drinking. The sound of people talking, the sound of music, what it's like, the sensation of bumping against people because they'd be shoulder to shoulder, things like that. I just engaged all of the senses and just threw the kitchen sink at him. Partly because I'm a competitive person, so when I get when someone challenges me, I definitely want to show them like, yeah, I can do this. But also because, you know, I'm just able to. It's not really a sweat to be able to do something like that. So it's supposed to be your run-of-the-mill tavern area. His character was supposed to be seated at a round wooden table, and he was ordering ale, and we were going to have this person that was going to be his traveling companion be one of the waitresses. So I introduce her and I give a little bit of a description of what she looks like. He had a few images of some ideas of what he wanted his characters to look like. I describe her. I say, well, she has red hair, these two bangs that flow on the sides of her cheeks, and most of her hair though is pulled backwards and braided into a single braid that goes along the middle of her back. I don't remember exactly what the description was, but I gave him a description. After I described, you know, what she looked like and gave her a little phrase, kind of going into role playing where I just gave her a little one-liner as though she was introducing herself, he said, "Oh, that's good and all, but you forgot one important detail." And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure I described almost every part of her appearance, from the possible weapons that she might have despite being a waitress, and what her clothes are like, the state of the clothes, the color, all this. I really went into detail. He said, you didn't mention how tall she was. And I'm like, how tall she is? He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, how tall did you picture her? And he said, well, I'd like to know what it's like to have to look up for so long. I'm like, look up? Oh, is she supposed to be tall? He then explains to me that he wanted this character to be like 6'7", and then he asks me, does my neck hurt when I look up at her? And I'm like, what the it's such a weird question to ask someone. Does my neck hurt when I look up at this person? And still not peeping the situation. I was like, yeah, sure, your neck hurts. It's all kinds of sore, and you're gonna feel it when you wake up the next morning. It's probably still gonna hurt when you look in certain directions. And anyways, he seemed really pleased with my description after I really explained just the difference in height between the two. So we start talking about the game even more, and the possible adventure styles that he could go along with based on the character that he had, especially in the combination of the two that they have. At some point we started talking about this NPC character again. We came back to it, and he had some ideas for character traits, except these traits weren't character traits. He proposed to me situations that could possibly happen during roleplay or just while they're adventuring. So first off, one of the interesting things is that he wanted his character to be a slave. I can't even say this with a straight face. So he wanted his character to be pulled along by shackles sometimes, or to have a loose rope around his neck and tugged like he was Gollum from Lord of the Rings. And I was like, okay, why is she... Are you just a prisoner, or are you an actual slave? And why is she imprisoning you? Is she not a good person? How is she your companion, if that's the dynamic that you have between you? He explains that over time he wants those two characters to get closer, and then she would stop having him as a slave. And I said, okay, it's a bit of a weird place to start, but sure, I guess I'm all for character development. That seems fine. Mind you, this is not clicking in my head. I'm a very oblivious person sometimes. So again, back to the character traits. He doesn't explain traits to me as much as he explains situations. So he would say, part of her character is if someone were to look at her in a certain way, like maybe she didn't have like all her clothes on, she would get like really nervous and like beat them up. But she's strong, so she would really hurt them. And I'm like, I don't know if that's a character trait. That type of stuff doesn't really come up in my games. And he actually cut me off and he started explaining it a little more. And he went into detail about these situations where maybe he accidentally ends up walking in on her when she went off to like a pond while they're in a forest to go take a quick shower, and maybe her armor is stacked up against a tree and she's of course out of her clothes as she's cleaning herself. He described that as a character trait. Like, she would get really embarrassed and shy if someone walked up on her and she'd get mad at him and beat him up. And I'm like, no, that sounds like something anyone would probably do if you were peeping on them. Still insisting that these are character traits and not scenarios that might appear in some sort of like ecchi anime. Went to also talk about another situation where he wants to happen in the game. Like, he started going into things that he definitely wants to happen, and he described a scenario where like they both end up falling for some reason. Maybe they're going across a bridge and one of them ends up tumbling on the other, but his hands appear on her chest, and then she'd get upset and like kick him in the balls. And I'm like, I mean, I guess that would be funny, but like, why? Then the last straw was when, you know, we're talking about it a little more, and I'm giving him a bit of a pushback at this point because I'm a bit confused, and at this point he's finally telling me like, I know, I'm asking you for a weird thing. And I'm like, dude, yes, you are. Somehow we got past it. I forgot what he said, but he must have been really good at persuasion rolls, because somehow I was still in this session 0 with him and considering running a game for him. So the last straw must have been when we were talking about their classes and going into, you know, what equipment they'll have, possible scenarios in which they can meet, and the story. And then he comes back to the discussion again, mentions this as a character trait for his character. Again, not character traits, just scenarios. And he describes a situation in which he drops his sword or whatever item and he looks up. And he said that it's important that she has a short skirt so that I, the DM, can describe what he sees when he looks up. And I'm like, boy, if you don't pay someone else for this stuff, like, listen, he's paying for this game, right? So there are services that you can pay for where someone can do this kind of funky role play with you, and it's no problem. You do you, boo. There's nothing wrong with it. Just approaching someone though and not really being upfront about what you want and trying to creep in things as the session 0 goes along is really, it felt really weird to me. So naturally I was weirded out, and I of course am not the type to judge anyone, but again, you know, just be upfront with what it is you want so I can listen and turn you down if it's not something I'm into. But I was so shocked during that encounter, the encounter being the session 0, that I came away from the session and I just went to go ask my family members, like, hey ma, is it weird if a guy asks you to blah 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 blah? And this has nothing to do with someone's sexuality, right? It doesn't matter if it's a guy or a girl asking you to do this, but just someone asking you to do this in general. My mom was like, yeah, that's weird, tell him no. And, you know, I asked a few other people, and just to make sure that I wasn't crazy. And yeah, it's kind of a weird thing to ask someone. So naturally I didn't end up running the game for the person, but just the entire situation and the things I was asked, and there are some things I cannot put in this video and explain because I think my account would get flagged if I described some of the things that this person wanted in the game. It was really, really weird, but that is my horror story. I don't know if this counts as a horror story, but this was like, I didn't know what I was getting into until like I was in the discussion talking with this person about this game. We had this discussion for a while. Like, he would sprinkle these things. I know there was like a long sequence of these scenarios, these things that he mentioned, but I guess I was there for so long because he sprinkled them in. He would mention one thing and then 40 minutes later he'd kind of come back to it, do like a segue. Like, he was a segue master. He just took the conversation, put tracks on it, and railroaded it back into that. It has to be a fetish at this point. Like, he must have been trying to experience some sort of anime fantasy from some weird ecchi harem anime, and that's obviously not the type of game I run. People want to run that type of game, that's fine, it's their business, but that's just not what I do, especially because I'm not in my own space. Especially because I don't want to, but I'm not in my own space. So it's already a bit weird enough for me to do certain voices when I'm at home, because sometimes my family members don't really get what I do. If they walk by my room and I'm describing certain spicy things happening, they'll be like, what the frig are you doing? So obviously I had to turn that down. Anyways, that is my I guess horror story. I'd love to know what your guys' weird situation horror stories were. Doesn't have to be anything as spicy as what happened here, but just like bad moments that you've experienced in your games. And yeah, I kept my promise. I'm not talking about players I've run games for. I didn't run a game for him. Still professional. Anyways, for now, I hope you guys have a good day. I'm now going to go enjoy the new expansion for Legends of Runeterra because some good cards coming out, and I'll see you guys next week.